Hello students, welcome to the fifth semester of this BA. This is my first lecture. I had shared some notes with you guys and I had already informed that what will I be covering for this semester. So Indian writing in English is one of the papers that you have for this semester, and within Indian writing in English, I'll be dealing with module 1, an introduction to Indian writing in English. And in your textbook, Indian Blossoms, we have a short story by Amrita Preetham, The Weed. I will also be discussing this story with you guys. But before we get into the text, specific text, including Amrita Preetham's short story, we need to have an overview of what it means when we say Indian writing in English. We need to look at the history of Indian writing in English. I had shared with you guys an essay by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, which appears as the introduction to an illustrated history of Indian writing in English, edited by Mehrotra himself. I hope you have had time to read through the essay because it is a really helpful essay. I would highly recommend all of you reading through the entire essay. But I will also be breaking down some of the key points of that essay in subsequent lectures. But before we get into the actual history of Indian writing in English, we need to know what we mean when we say Indian writing in English. And that is exactly what we will be looking at in this lecture. What do we mean by Indian writing in English? It has three key terms: Indian, writing, and English. Indian is a seemingly straightforward term, but when you look at the nuances, who can be considered Indian in terms of writing in English or Indian literature is very complicated. Somebody who is a passport holder, who is an identifiable citizen of India, if he is writing, then his literature is often considered almost unequivocally considered as Indian writing in English. But even there is some complication in this seemingly straightforward category. Say, an author like Vikram Seth, who is an Indian, who has an Indian citizenship, who has lived in America for long years, and when he writes a work like The Golden Gate, which is about American concerns, about American characters, with not a single Indian character or a single mention to India, he's writing it in sonnet sequence, which is sonnet is a very European kind of literary genre, and the sonnet sequence is Russian in its origin, and what he creates is has no relation to India whatsoever. Do we consider it as part of Indian writing in English merely because he is an Indian citizen? Maybe, maybe not. It is a very complicated question, but for basic understanding, basic definition, we do consider Indians who are passport holding citizens of India writing in English as part of Indian writing in English. Moving on, an Indian could also be somebody who is a member of Indian diaspora, some say his father or mother or some um, one of the grandparents had moved from India and settled abroad. Jhumpa Lahiri is an example of a diaspora writer, and a diaspora writer could also be somebody who migrated, who is a first generation migrant to a foreign country and settled there, assumed, say, a US citizenship or a Canadian citizenship, but still is writing about India and Indian concerns, about uh, the, the heritage of India and all those concerns. Then that is also part of this literature. If we extend this definition of Indian, any work by any individual who has experienced India, say, come and settle down in India and experience the Indian milieu and writes about that experience, like Ruth Pravar Jhabwala, who was married to an Indian and settled down in Mumbai, and writes about that experience of being lived in Mumbai in her novels. So Rudra Jhabwala is also an Indian part of Indian literature in English. So citizenship is not the only criterion for who becomes an Indian writer in English. So this literature is vast. When we say writing, writing can be of any sort, a blog post, an SMS, a grocery list, all of these are writings. But when in this context, when we talk about Indian writing, we are talking about works of literature in many genres, including poetry, novels, stories, plays, memoirs, letters, and biographies. This is not an exhaustive list. All kind of literatures can be included, like comics and songs are also part of Indian writing in English, but here our concern is largely to conventional forms of literature, conventional genres of Indian literature like poetry, novels, stories, and plays. When we say in English, it means the language of writing that we are examining is exclusively English. We are not looking at works of translation. Some of these writers might have written in a regional language and in English, but what we are looking at is original writings done in English. We are also examining the history of this writing, Indians writing in English language, not in translation. So this is the boundary of Indian writing in English as we will be discussing. Now, let us look at the history of nomenclature. When we say Indian writing in English, it is not a term beyond argument. There has been many names used to describe this language, literature, and let us look at some of the examples here. I have listed 6 other alternatives. First being Anglo-Indian literature, which was introduced by a British scholar of the name E.F. Orton. This British scholar uses the term Anglo-Indian literature to describe writings by Englishmen who had lived or experienced India in some ways and wrote about India. Writings about India by Englishmen who have lived in India is what he called Anglo-Indian literature. Some of the later Indian scholars as well have used the term Anglo-Indian literature to describe writings by Englishmen about India and also by some of the Indian writers about Indian experiences. But this is an early term and it has a racial connotation. Anglo-Indian means a particular, nowadays when we refer to Anglo-Indians, we are referring to only a particular group of people who are of both English and Indian origin. Only a combined race origin person will be referred to as Anglo-Indian. And now when we refer to Anglo-Indian literature, we are referring to the works of Anglo-Indians, of people of that particular race. Indo-Anglian literature is an alternative uh, uh, propagated by K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar. He says he is not the one who coined the term. He says the term was in existence before him, but K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, who wrote the first historical account of Indian writing in English, and he called it Indian writing in English. He is the one who propagated the term Indo-Anglian literature to refer to the combination of Indian and English concerns in literature. Indo-Anglican literature was used only once and it was an accident. A printer misprinted Indo-Anglian to Indo-Anglican in one of K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar's works, and it was dismissed as not logical. Anglican has some connotations that are undesirable to the form of literature and thus is not used ever again. Indo-English, on the other hand, is also sometimes used. The argument for Indo-English over Indo-Anglian is that Indo-Anglian has the connotation that it is a relationship between India and England rather than between India and English. Indo-English makes it clear that the relation is between Indo and English. But what would you call a writer in Indo-English? He would have to be referred to as an Indo-Englishman, and which sounds ridiculous and not not exactly, it conveys something that you are not uh, intending to convey. So Indo-English is also vastly unpopular term. Indian English literature, however, is a term that is preferred by Sahitya Academy, and the history commissioned by Sahitya Academy, History of Indian Literature, Indian Writings in English, commissioned by Sahitya Academy, was edited by M.K. Naik, and he prefers the term Indian English literature and he uses it for his history of this field of study. Indian English has but that connotation of being some kind of, in some ways, different from the standard English or British English literature. So Indian English literature is also not very much preferred by academicians of Indian writing in English. On the other hand, Anglophone Indian literature is a very modern term used by Ranjit Hoskote, framed by Ranjit Hoskote, who argues that Indo-Anglian, the other popular term, and Indo-English, Indian English literature is a popular term popularized by Sahitya Academy. He rejects it, saying that Indian English is something very specific. This is English written by Indians. It is in no way a specialized kind of English literature. It is English literature, part of English literature written by Indians. So that term is rejected. Indo-Anglian has the suggestion. He says Indo-Anglian. He quotes Mehrotra, who says Indo-Anglian refers to a literature written by Indians before independence, before modernism. The modernist movement comes into Indian literature. Whatever has been written can be referred to as Indo-Anglian literature. But that literature, that tradition has died out, and Indo-Anglian is an outdated term, and we need an updated term for this field of literature. Ranjit Hoskote's alternative, which is the academic alternative, is Anglophone Indian literature. Why is it called academic? Because it is not easily understood by the layman. What do you mean by Anglophone when it is spoken out? You need explanation of what is Anglophone. Anglophone refers to something that is inclined towards English. So Indian literature that is inclined towards English. He models this, Hoskote models this term uh, from Francophone literatures in Africa, Francophone African literature, which means an African writing in French, because it was a French colony of many parts of Africa were French colonies, and if an African, a person of African origin is writing or a writing from Africa uses French language, it is called Francophone African literature. It has the connotation of a relationship between a country, that is India, and the language, which is English. Anglophone, that is inclined towards English language. So Anglophone Indian literature is his preferred term. Indian writing in English is, however, the term that is most widely, most popularly used, and is the title of your uh, syllabus as well, title of your paper as well. So Indian writing in English is circumlocutory. It covers a vast arena of literature, and even though it is dismissed by Hoskote as a vacuous catch-all terminology, he says he wants to uproot this term from all textbooks and all essays and all references ever made to this field of literature. But it is such a convenient shorthand. It's admirably compact. It's a very convenient shorthand and is used widely by everybody and widely easily understood by everybody. It is um, uh, son of P. Lal, the founder of um, Writers Workshop in Kolkata. His son, Professor Anand Lal, says that Indian writing in English, I like Indian writing in English for its ease of access, but also the fact that whatever we call this field of literature, it doesn't matter what we call this field of literature, because after all, a rose by any name smells as sweet. He quotes Shakespeare and says, a rose by any name smells as sweet. So it doesn't matter what term that we use, it does matter because each of these terms have a connotation, but Indian writing in English, since it is easy to use, is flexible enough to accommodate many of the politics and variations of this field of literature, and we will be using Indian writing in English. The field of literature is what is important, is what Professor Anandalal means to say by his reference to Shakespeare. Whatever we call it, the field of study is important enough to be focused upon and to be understood clearly. Thank you. We'll continue the discussion in another lecture.